Watching Beyond Markets, welcome. I'm Kenneth Igbomor, and thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We'll discuss expectations for Nigeria's next cabinet. You can join the conversation by using the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can also send tweets to our handle at CNBC Africa. Now, ahead of the May 29th swearing-in ceremony in Nigeria, the Chamberlain Peterside, the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisors, joins me to discuss expectations for Nigeria's next cabinet. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, Chamberlain.
Thank you, Ken. Always a pleasure.
First, let's backtrack a little before we get into how the ministries have performed over the years. But let's look at the last 4 years and then the challenges we had to face, we knew we were going to face, and how they kind of squared up to the challenges.
Yeah. Well, the first challenge was the recession, which started in the third quarter of 2015, which was probably the deepest recession we've had in the last 25 years. But thankfully, that kind of took us for a couple of quarters until we came out of it. But the government was slow starting. Quite ironically, you didn't have the full cabinet in place up till 2015 ending, which also might have added to the mix of the issues that were confronting the government because of the recession on one hand and then the declining price of oil. We saw a real dip in budget receipts, and therefore Naira became under serious pressure. We saw at the peak, Naira was almost hitting $500 Naira per dollar, which was totally unprecedented. So all that put an enormous pressure on both the governance and the private citizens. And of course, the businesses also suffered a lot. We see the TSA, which was an effort to mop up government revenue from private banks into the central bank. That actually created a liquidity squeeze on the banks. And that hence resulted to their inability to fund SMEs going forward. So we've seen a confluence of factors starting from the 2015 and beyond that had actually inhibited the efforts of the new government to truly operate at an optimal level.
All right, but looking back now, do you think some things could have been done differently?
Yes, one thing that should have been done differently was to hit the ground running much faster. We had the elections somewhere around March, and then we had the transition end of May. So that was a 2 months, 6 weeks lag, whereby the government should have been formed, the cabinet should have been formed. And so if it took you from March, April, up to October, November to form a government, that truly put a damper on the ability of the new administration to really be up and running. You needed the ministers, strictly speaking. The president thought differently. He thought he could operate with the permanent secretaries. But the ministers are the chief accounting officers, and therefore you need them to truly run the affairs of state. And that was quite a bit of, that put a big of drag on governance. Second point was the inaction or the slow to action on trying to stabilize the currency, the Naira. That was a major, major factor, if you ask me, that led to the recession.
All right, but then let's look at the policy response so far on all fronts, on most of these challenges. How do you think we squared up to these challenges policy-wise?
Policy-wise, we were slow, but I think we were able to handle and probably withstand the recession simply because the government was much more prudent. I would quite frankly say the government was much more disciplined. We coming out of a very high oil price where we had money all over the place into a recessionary trend where there was liquidity, low oil price, high capex, high OPEX, and then low liquidity. It put a squeeze on our debt level. It put a squeeze on government revenue. But in midst of that, I'll give some credit that the government was able to handle it. We saw the foreign reserves, which was on a low level, actually rise marginally during the recession. That's unusual for your reserves to grow when you're in a recession. But of course, the excess crude account was at a very low level because we didn't save when we needed to. And so to be able to withstand all that shock in a very short space of time and still be standing, I think we have to give some credit here.
Then the central bank on how they, handle the FX crisis that we're having, because we had the liquidity, foreign exchange liquidity issues in there. We have a lot of dollars in circulation, and then kind of led snowballed into that full-blown crisis. But when you look at the policy response from the central bank, with the investors and exporters window, how do you think that has played out so far?
I think the response by creating the NIFEX in the investor window was a welcome development, but it came a little too late. I mean, it took us a year and a half or thereabout, whilst the Naira was sliding constantly. It took a while for the government to realize that, listen, it has to take a protracted action to stem the decline in the value of Naira. Otherwise, it was going to be a real big hit. And so, therefore, with that effort to try to stabilize Naira, create an independent investor window, it kind of really stabilized things differently. And since then, we've seen Naira, trading at a very stable range, even though the official rate is still 305, but in the investor window, it's remained 360, 361 for the last 2 years and counting. I think that's a welcome development.
All right, but let's look at budget and the budgeting process.
Yeah.
When you look at the last 4 years, of this administration, and you look at how successive budgets year in, year out were plagued with almost the same problem every time, every year. What does that speak to the budgeting process, and if we've learned from our past mistakes?
From my own experience in my life as a public servant, wearing that shoe of anchoring a budget and trying to develop and create a budget, I thought I saw quite a bit of issues with using your numbers from a previous year as a benchmark to just fill in the gaps and say you've created a new budget. That to me was quite a shock. But I think that's the practice. And that is not a welcome practice, because how we've created our budget so far has allowed for, cut and paste sort of approach. And so what it does is it doesn't allow you to prioritize, it doesn't allow you to inject new blood, inject new ideas into the budget to prioritize new type of spend. And so I think going forward with the effort to create midterm budget programs, I think it might help. But the emphasis, if you ask me, has to shift from prioritizing OPEX to creating more funds that you can invest in your capital expenditure. And then, of course, also shifting emphasis into social services and human development expenditure, and as well as security.
Okay, so now let's get into the scorecard of the ministries, and the ministers, and let's look at, first, I'd like to start off first with, first, who got the toughest job, who we knew had the toughest job, and let's look at how well they squared up to the challenges.
I think the toughest job, pretty much, you might call the infrastructure ministry, the centerpiece of the infrastructure space, which is the Ministry of Housing, Works, and Power. They were all different, those are different ministries, but how they were merged into one is still a mystery to me. But I guess the effort was to try to streamline and cut down costs. But ultimately, it meant that there was a lot of work for that ministry. I mean, power alone, as a standalone ministry, it's tough enough. Then adding to that, roads, federal roads, and infrastructure and bridges, and then, of course, housing. I think of those three areas, where the ministry has performed the best would be in power. Now, the best would be relative. Does it mean that we'll have more light? More regular light? Does it mean that the transmission lines and distribution is much more efficient? In a way, yes. But I think the power...
Some would argue with that, too.
Yeah, well, I mean, generation capacity has increased. I mean, right now we have about 7,000 megawatts. But transmission remains a problem, as well as distribution. But more importantly, I would think that the most progress we've achieved in power is in the regulatory framework, in the regulatory regime that now allows you to develop any power plant below 1 megawatt without any licensing, without any approvals. Just go ahead and build it. And of course, the transition, the gradual shift to power that doesn't rely on the national grid, off-grid power. I think that's where we made the most progress.
And even on the metering, though, because we're seeing meter access providers are coming on board as well, and that, I think that would be a game changer with getting people having to have meters.
Yes. But the distribution companies are still plagued with a lot of debt. They're still performing below expectation, and but we hope that it's a two-way street. If you meter everyone and you improve collection, that would mean probably higher inflow coming to the distribution companies, and hopefully that would enable them invest more, recoup their investments, and then be more optimally optimal performance, achieve more better
I'm
performance.
actually very curious to know which your top 5 ministries in your estimation perform the most.
I think, to me, the first one would be Ministry of Power, Housing, and roads infrastructure. Second will be Ministry of Transportation. Yes, we know that Nigeria for the last several decades haven't had a robust railway network, but we know, looking up now, almost everyone is aware of the fact that there's action in that regard. There's a lot of construction going on. There's a lot of new investments that is coming on stream in the infrastructure space, in railway particularly. And that could be a real game changer that would open up the central flanks of the country, the eastern corridors, open up mining areas, agricultural, vast agricultural lands.
We saw quite a number of partnerships signed in that ministry.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to take a protracted effort. Steps. You have to take steps before you see results. Why we haven't been able to, get where we should be is taking those steps, thinking it through and being very methodical and constructive. And then you walk through it until you begin to actualize.
Yeah, because people always want to see how it trickles down to the man on the street.
Ultimately, the man on the street should be the benefactor of whatever investments we do, whether it's in social infrastructure, whether it's in human capital or physical infrastructure. But how that translates to improvement is in the lifestyle and the quality of life and the cost of living. It's a little bit, it's something that takes a little bit of time. So if you start an infrastructure plan right now, you need at least 2-3 years, 48 months, maybe beyond, to be able to develop the infrastructure, build it, and then it opens up, vast lands. We've seen that a lot with roads. That hopefully should also happen with railway.
All right, then we'll keep that.
And of course, I might also add the third ministry, agriculture. We've seen quite a bit of diversification that has occurred in agriculture.
Yeah, I'd like to get the remaining 3 when we come back from the break. So just hold that thought. I've been speaking to Chamberlain Peterside. He's the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisors. If you're just joining us, Chamberlain Peterside, the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisors, is with me today, and we're discussing expectations for Nigeria's next cabinet. Before we went on break, I asked him a question about the top 5 ministries that he felt had performed the most, and he started off mentioning the Ministry of Power, Works and Housing. He also mentioned the Ministry of Transportation, and then he was just about to tell us about agriculture.
Yes, agriculture. Agriculture has done fairly well, given that we've seen a gradual but steady shift in the population that are getting into agriculture, or the funding programs being created by central bank and administered by the Ministry of Finance has been quite encouraging. We have seen some bit of diversification into agriculture. Exports have grown. We've seen the advent of new players. Anywhere you go, you hear quite a lot of narrative about agriculture. And when that is the case in an economy, then you know that there's quite a lot of attention in that space. But it wasn't by chance that all that happened. It was consciously driven. We do have a minister who is quite active, who is a farmer himself. He talks a lot about it and is proud of it. And that has helped shift focus. Nigeria measures quite high in a lot of the agricultural products right now, whether it's rice, cocoa beans. A lot of cash crops have begun to be on the top league, as far as I'm concerned, for Nigeria in the export market. There's still a lot to be done in the sense that we're a large country. A large portion of the population are, still reside in the rural areas, and the level of mechanization in agriculture is still quite low. The anchor finance program by the central bank is very encouraging, but you still need the real actors in the agricultural space being able to access it. And I hear that the president had given a marching order that that fund should be disbursed without collateral. And we do have, we know the issues that always plagues, any kind of funding, whether it's in the real sector, whether it's in agriculture. They have to ask you for your collateral, and it's always an inhibiting factor. But those obstacles and those hurdles have begun to kind of be dismantled. And we hope that if we consistently, stay on this path of diversification, maybe Nigeria would become a major agricultural.
All right, but I'd still like to hear the last two ministries, though, because you're giving us your top 5.
I'm actually reluctant to, name 5 ministries, but, I tried to crack my brain and I ended up with 4. The next one would be finance. Finance in the sense that the policy trust, the fiscal policy and, budgetary, arrangements resides under this ministry. So take something like TSA, where the government had to ensure that all proceeds and all revenue accruing to government agencies had to be moved to the central bank. I think that the finance ministry had done quite well in its conscious effort to track this and make sure that it's implemented. We still have some agencies that have tactically evaded this, but I think the effort and the zeal of the Ministry of Finance in pursuing this had resulted to, I would say, some measure of sanity amongst agencies keeping multiple accounts and still relying on government process. Now, there's a next step, which if you ask me, I would suggest, which is that how does government administer those proceeds with central banks? The banks are truly starved of funds because these resources have now been transferred to the central bank. So what do you do?
That's taking money out of the real sector and how it plays.
Absolutely. How does it play out? It's not been quite favorable to the private sector that the banks are unable to fund. SMEs have really suffered because the banks are starved of these funds. They have to be active in the economy. There has to be, these resources that should be deployed in productivity and in production sectors. But that hasn't been the case. So that's, you might say, TSA 2.0. That the ministry should be looking at.
So maybe just trying to see how they can make things work better for both sides.
Yes, how they track it more proactively and make sure that those funds can be deployed and used for productive purposes.
All right, but then moving on, I'd like to shift the focus now to the ministries that have a direct impact on human capital development and how well they fared.
That would be health and education. And then, of course, social welfare and then women affairs. They haven't fared quite well, if you ask me quite frankly, because it's not my word, it's the numbers. Numbers don't lie. The indices, that we hear all the time hasn't been quite encouraging. We surpassed India, for instance, as a country that hosts the most number of, poor people, and life expectancy hasn't been quite encouraging, and a few other human development indices. Now, those are the underlying numbers that reflects how well these ministries have performed. And if they haven't, education, we've seen the strike by lecturers in universities that kept students out of, classrooms for many, many months.
And talk of the out-of-school children as well.
Oh, yeah. And then we have the largest number of, out-of-school children worldwide. And so these are numbers that are very poor reflection of how these ministries have performed. But they will also talk about funding. Everybody tries to attribute all the problems to funding, not to the actions that they should have taken, but to funding. But that's a different matter. What ratio of our budget is allocated to those ministries?
I think it brings to mind the question around, getting technocrats in position and having politicians in positions. Because when you look at some of these ministries, I would think that I would really like to see more technocrats who understand the underlying issues in some of these ministries, drive them. Yes, for the health ministry, yes, we have a doctor in there, but then we need to look at, how the ministry has evolved over the years and how much needs to, because when it's not just checking on indices, there's quite a lot of work that needs to go. In fact, these two areas, health and education, in fact, all the work for you to see the results of it has to have happened 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
It's human capital, and then it's usually the effect will be seen well over time.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Kenneth, but the politicians will tell you that they're also technocrats. And so how can you argue with that? But the reality is, if you're in a government position, in a public service position, there's no alternative to your performance. There's no alternative to doing the job. Hunkering down on doing the job, and the job is tough. Yes, we can dance around it. We can be inefficient, and we, allow politics to overshadow concrete action. But that's where the difference is with a pure play technocrat. Where the facts are laid bare, where your emphasis and your commitment is, when it's in performance and in delivering results, then there's no two ways about it. But what we've seen, obviously, is that you give positions based on patronage. When a political party wins an election, it has to compensate those who've been supportive, has to compensate party members. And to an extent, that has an impact on how that party ultimately performs, while it's governing.
Okay.
So if there could be a balance between positions that are very strategic and key to national development and positions that are compensatory. If you make that delineation, then you could decide to say, look, politicians, we love you all, but this is what we can do. But these are the key drivers of the economy. We want hardcore technocrats to man those ministries.
All right, now let's move on to the key revenue generator, which is the Ministry of Petroleum. Yeah. And let's see how that has spread in the years in. We've seen the oil prices, over time, challenges in there. Now this ministry is run, by the president, but we have the Minister of State for Petroleum, Ibe Kachuku, in that position. But let's look at how that has fared so far. Recently, we've heard quite a number of things come out from that ministry. We've heard about landing cost for petroleum getting to about 180 naira now, and it means that NNPC is still paying on a recovery, in form of more like subsidies, depending on the name used for it there. But how would you rate this ministry so far?
I think there are a few things that have happened in that ministry. Number one is, we haven't had that spate of scarcity of petroleum products in the past. Of course, we had it December 2018 or thereabout, 17. That was a singular moment where we had scarcity, as opposed to previous years where you had scarcity every now and then. We know that the petroleum importers are still owed quite a bit of money, but we've seen a little bit of regularity and predictability in the supply of refined products. To me, that's probably the biggest plus that this ministry has achieved. Because beyond that, we still have the refineries that are not functioning. We're still paying subsidy, depending on how you look at it. And then, of course, to my mind, the petroleum industry bill that should be the key driver at the forefront of that whole industry is still pending, not passed. Still a lot of debate.
Although we've seen quite a if you look at the last 4 years of this administration, we'll say some traction has come up with that bill.
But you need
them splitting it up into the petroleum industry and governance bill.
Exactly.
Exactly. We've seen it passed at the Senate level, but then still waiting.
Yes. But passing that bill would ultimately change the dynamics of the industry. But Kenneth, before you talk about changing dynamics, the petroleum industry, oil and gas industry, the petroleum industry, which is crude, not gas, petroleum industry is a dying industry. If you were to segment and classify all the possible industries and sectors around the world, it is a dying industry, just like you had the, steel and alloy, just like you had the coal industry dying off. So any measure, any policy measure that the ministry is going to enact, if you ask me, should be a stopgap measure towards transitioning out of petroleum industry into clean energy. Gas already will have in abundance, but there's less emphasis on gas than there is in crude oil, because crude oil is the main income earner. I hear about building refineries in Saudi Arabia, investing in new refineries. I hear a lot about doubling production capacity by 2025. You're making strong effort in a dying industry where other countries, major consumers of refined products, are already de-emphasizing the utilization of hydrocarbon. How are you going to survive into the future? Gas is there for you to explore. Clean energy is also there for you to explore. So unless we transform the petroleum industry to an energy ministry, not a energy as in power, but an energy ministry that would take
all-encompassing.
Yes, take a much more broader look of the energy mix, clean energy, solar energy, and other forms of energy. If we do that, unless we do that, I think we will be dwelling and spending too much time and emphasis on a dying sector, and that is very delicate for Nigeria.
All right, then. Thank you so much for your contribution to this show. I wish we had more time to dissect more of these ministries. I had quite a number that I still had lined up that we're going to discuss, but fortunately, time has not been our friend. But thank you so much for your contribution to this show.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Speaking to
Thank you.
Chamberlain Peterside, is the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisors. And that's it on Beyond Markets, and thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Igbomor. Have a wonderful day.